I am delighted to introduce the South African crime writer, Margie Orford.
Hello.
Margie grew up in Namibia and South Africa, where she studied English and film at the University of Cape Town. And in fact, I believe, Margie, you took some of your final exams from prison. She had been detained during the 1985 state of emergency. And I know that topic is going to come up a little bit later. She's got a master's degree in comparative literature from the Graduate School of the City University of New York. And she recently completed a PhD in creative and critical writing at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And in that PhD, she's very interestingly analysing the politics of sexual violence against women in South Africa. And she's asking about how creative writers can ethically represent pain, violence and trauma in South African women's lives. I'm sure these topics and many more are going to come up in today's Q&A. And let me just alert you and warmly invite you to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. You're warmly invited to submit questions through the Q&A, and then I will pose those, or as many as possible, to Margie when we get to the Q&A part of today's session. Well, Margie's been described as the queen of South African crime thriller writers. She's written 5 Claire Hart's novels, and they've been translated into at least 9 languages, featuring the South African detective and TV personality, Dr. Claire Hart. And we'll be hearing more about Claire Hart today as Margie reads from and talks about her novel, Daddy's Girl. Margie has recently completed another new novel, and she's currently working on her memoirs, which will be published soon. And I'm really excited to announce that she's kindly agreed to read a section of her memoirs today, alongside an extract from Daddy's Girl. As well as being a novelist, Margie is also an award-winning journalist. She's also been a member of the executive board of PEN International and a former president of PEN in South Africa. She's still very active as part of PEN. She co-authored the PEN International Women's Manifesto, co-authored that back in 2017, and continues to be very present on the websites and materials for PEN. She's the patron of Rape Crisis and of the children's book charity, the Little Hands Trust. And she herself has written a number of children's books, as well as several works of non-fiction on subjects ranging from climate change to rural development. One reviewer said that Margie writes with, quote, a South African social conscience, and her work's been described as unflinchingly honest. And on that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce her today, to welcome her. She's currently located, as you may see from her background, currently located in Edinburgh, where she's on a fellowship at Edinburgh University. So welcome from all of us, Margie. And I wonder if you'd like to start off by telling us a bit more about your work. And then when you're ready, you can read from Daddy's Girl in your new memoir. And you might like to tell us a little bit about your prison experience as well. I know we're all interested in that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and hello to all of you in Yale. I don't know if you're there at university or where you are. It's lovely to imagine you on the other side of the screen. And so I was at Yale a few years ago now, and it will be lovely to be with you in person. But Steph, thank you for having me here, and for that very nice introduction. And as Steph said, we're going to have lots of questions. So I'm just going to talk a very little bit, and then hopefully hear from you what your interests are and how, kind of what you want to know about the work and how it fits in with your own interests and various things. So I thought I would just start by saying why I wrote crime fiction, why I switched to crime fiction, because I had been an investigative journalist for a very long time. And one of the areas that I looked at was organized crime, was one of them. Another one was this unbelievably high level of violence against women and children in South Africa. And one of the things that struck me when I went back to live in South Africa in 2001 was how this unbelievable political transformation had happened, post Mandela, to use a kind of metonymic thing for the huge struggle and the kind of transformation that had happened on that level. And yet it seemed to me what was really an undeclared civil war of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s had sublimated and gone into these very intimate spaces, particularly around the body. So I did a lot of journalistic work, kind of looking at following up on cases on murders. I was working with the police a lot. I was working with survivors groups, with survivors, with people who had been murdered and their families and the kind of fallout. So it was a very close kind of working. And what I found, to kind of put it very simply, was that in journalism and in nonfiction, you can list a series of facts, but the facts didn't get me to the truth. It didn't get to me to this very complex origin of violence that you have in South Africa. And fiction, you've got 100,000 words in a novel, and you've got 2,000 words if you're writing a story, a news story. And so in the fiction that I wrote, which is really a kind of exploration of the nature of power, the nature of violence, post-colonial violence, how the effects of the very long history of slavery in South Africa, what it had many parallels with the US. I mean, the US and South Africa have got a great deal in common in terms of their histories and what is both acknowledged and denied. So in the fiction, I could get to the tectonics of things. I read violence very much as a symptom for something much deeper. And so in the fiction, what I'm looking for is what the origins are, where it comes from, how the sort of social and political forces at work produce a particular kind of language. So those of you interested can follow up on that. I wrote an article a couple of years ago called The Grammar of Violence, which looks at how one reads violence as a language. So I think, shall I just read a little bit from Daddy's Girl now? So I thought I'm going to read you chapter 2. First chapter of Daddy's Girl is set in a prison, not the prison I was in, but a prison about an hour and a half outside Cape Town, actually, the prison Mandela was released from, and where I did, at the time of writing Daddy's Girl, I was conducting a year-long creative writing workshop in this particular prison, which starts the novel. And those of you who are interested in reading about that work I was doing, just have a look on the Guardian website. I wrote a piece for them while I was doing it. Very interesting working. They were all maximum security prisoners, and it gave me a very good understanding of where they'd come from. But this little piece I'm going to read to you, one of the most interesting ways of looking at South Africa, and one of the most enduring aspects of, I think, part of why post-apartheid society, where you've got segregation has endured for so long, is the spatial apartheid, the separation of where white people lived, where colored people, as they call in South Africa, mixed race people could live, and where Black people could live. Very stratified, very racialized, the sort of economics of it. So all the books which are set in Cape Town have this structural racism literally built into the city. So we meet Claire Hart when she's driving. She's been called out. She's investigating the disappearance of a little girl. So I'll just start and read chapter 2. Green. Claire Hart nosed across the Friday morning traffic, the taxis and buckies surging towards the city. Red. 3 Indian crows feeding on a dog's carcass hopped back and forth at the lights. Black eyes fixed on the traffic, their timing impeccable. A huddle of boys rolling dice, betting with bottle tops, stared at Claire. Chained dogs barked in the litter-strewn yards. She was looking for a street with no name, its sign long since torn down and sold for scrap metal. Claire looked up at the pockmarked buildings, 3-story walk-ups that baked in summer and froze in winter. The flats. The buildings were named after battles fought long ago by people who'd lived far away. Waterloo, Hastings, Agincourt, Trafalgar, Tobruk. The people who lived in this place called it Baghdad. Coke adds life, a hand-painted slogan in red and white on the wall of a corner cafe, its small dispensing window covered with hand grenade mesh. On the opposite corner, the primary school, rubbish swagged against rusting barbed wire. The playground was filled with children in white shirts. The girls wearing bottle green skirts, the boys in grey pants. In a corner, a little girl stood alone under a bullet-riddled sign. Your neighborhood watch watches out for you. The child was clutching a lunchbox. Her eyes, large and dark, were on Claire as she drove past. A pair of older boys appeared out of nowhere, swarming around the little girl, knocking her sandwiches from her hand and jerking her between them. The child did nothing to protect herself. One boy pushed a rough, probing hand up her skirt, and the child's tears tumbled down her drawn cheeks. Claire pressed her hooter, and the boys, 10, 11 years old, turned to stare. She was on one side of the fence, and they were on the other. They gave the girl a final shove and were off in a pack, joining a game of soccer on the dusty field. The girl picked herself up and left, straightening her skirt as she ran, tucking in her white shirt, absorbing the casual violation, abandoning her trampled lunch. The lights changed and Claire drove on. The hookstanders eyed her, the smallest of them disappearing down an alley as she passed. News of her presence was traveling ahead of her. She checked the car's central locking. Orange. Claire slowed. The shabby buildings were pitted. In a fortnight, 5 children had been killed in a surge of gang warfare. Small white coffins were brandished at funerals by grim-faced uncles and brothers promising revenge. In tow were the resigned mothers who sobbed when they went home to wait for the next convulsion of violence, the next lot of casualties. It had not come, not yet. El Alamein, bleached to a trace, the letters indicated the block Claire was looking for. A freshly painted hammer and sickle claimed the territory for the Afghans. She stopped. Then the boy who's meeting her takes her up to his mother, whose daughter has disappeared. I just want to read you a little bit about that, and then we can go into questions. So the woman standing in front of Claire was tiny. She looked 50 and was probably 35. She took Claire's hand. Dr. Hart? Claire, I'm Mrs. Adams, she said. Come inside. Claire followed her into the living room, where the kitchen had been curtained off from the sofas crowded around the television. Above the screen was a studio photograph of a little girl, her white dress spotless, the halo of curls tamed for the photographer, green eyes fixed on Claire. That's her, doctor. She lit a cigarette. The ghost of that perfect face still hovered in the woman's own hollow features, despite their being scripted with the story of the place where she lived. The scar on her lip was the signature of a husband's fist. Her eyes were fierce and green, the same color as Lemmeke's, her son, as those of her missing daughter. Where is she? I want you to film this, said Mrs. Adams, so you'll have the truth down. Claire took out her camera and panned from the photograph of the little girl to the woman by her side. She's gone yesterday. You saw her yesterday? Claire asked. She was here. She was here? The woman dropped her head into her hands. I thought she was at my mother's. And she's not? My mother sent her for cigarettes and she didn't come home. They thought the child had come back here. Lemmeke and his friends went to look for her, but she was gone. The weight of it closed in on Claire. You've looked everywhere? She asked Lemmeke. All her friends, all my aunties, said Lemmeke. Lemmeke means blade, by the way. My other Omar. And no one has her? Nobody. You've checked at the shop, asked Claire, and she'd arrived? Yes. The woman gave her the cigarettes. And no one saw her with anybody. Lemmeke shook his head. What else? Asked Claire. There was a car in the street, tinted windows, said Lemmeke. Someone else says an uncle was talking to her. And then Claire tells them that she's a journalist. I'm just skipping ahead so we've got enough time. She says, I track what happens to them, said Claire, taking her eye from the camera. The girls I found, there was no way to say gently, they were already dead. Mrs. Adams folded her arms around her hollow belly. If she's dead, then I want her body. Find me something to bury at least. Mrs. Adams took another cigarette from the pack on the table and wormed her way to the window, through the narrow space between the wall and the couch, and she lifted the curtain. She sucked on her cigarette as if it was a lifeline. Harry Oppenheimer has the gold mines. Fulke Arendt and his gangsters have this. She waved her hand to the warren of matchbox houses and backyard shacks. A gold mine too. They own the police. If I go to the police, then my baby is dead for sure. They're not going to watch so much power get sold out from under them. Who's buying? Asked Claire. Buying, selling. Gangsters, police, politicians. Mrs. Adams turned her green eyes on Claire. For us that live here, it's all the same. We're the ones who pay in the beginning and in the end. Now I'll stop there.
Thank you, Margie.
Now that I've set the scene, maybe before we have questions, I could set up a little context of where this novel comes from. Because I wanted to say what I did towards this novel. I'm sure you're all aware of the conventions of crime fiction and various things. So what I did to write this particularly harrowing novel was to simply clip stories for 2 weeks in the Cape Times, which is the main newspaper, of missing children, missing little girls. And I think there were 9 or 10, 11 of them, of these children who just vanished and disappeared. Some of them were found. And unlike what you would hope in fiction, there's a serial murderer, you can find them, you can catch them. What I was trying to do was create a portrait in which a society functioned as the serial killer. What it was the context in which these children lived. That's the scene I was setting here.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Margie. And what you say overlaps with quite a few of the questions that have come in for you. And can I just encourage people, please do post your questions to the Q&A bar, and we'll present those to Margie as the session develops. But some of the questions that we've had already are very much about you know, this interesting overlap that you've described between taking clips from the newspapers and then moving towards fiction. And, you know, the medium of fiction allows you to do very different things from the, as you've said already, from the sort of the literary clippings, you know, that there's not enough space to develop your themes. But a question came in from Dominique Castanara, and she's asking about, you know, specifically, why do you choose literature, and especially fiction, as a way of exploring this theme of gendered violence in South Africa? And she's particularly interested in how the medium of fiction compares to journalism. And perhaps, you know, given that you've worked in journalism as well as fiction, I wonder if you could talk about a little bit more about what fiction kind of makes available with this theme of gendered violence in particular.
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, it's a complicated question that, you know, when you're doing, if you're reporting something, you list the facts in a way you're positioned in a position of coherence and authority, and you describe what has happened. It's very difficult to, or you can't evoke the kind of trauma that people endure, the kind of feeling of it, the feeling of the experience. And one of the things that you can do in fiction, and I do it in Daddy's Girl with this little girl who, Ridwan Faisal's daughter, who Claire's like sidekick, who is kidnapped, is to create her feeling of fear and terror. And one of the gifts that fiction gives you, especially you have the kind of third-person narrative point of view that you have in a crime novel, is to inhabit the experience of a person who is suffering. Now, the ethical question, and I'm sure those of you looked at the kind of feminist critiques around this, is, and the dilemma that I was faced with is, do we deal with gendered violence by saying nothing, by not describing it, or do you step into this kind of minefield, and it is an ethical minefield, of describing and trying to evoke in your reader a feeling of what it is to be a survivor, what it is to endure something within a genre, particularly the crime fiction genre, which very often replicates the spectacle of violence. How do you do it without performing it? So one of the areas that I try this very deliberately is to try to undermine the reader or the viewer's feeling of scopic power. So you take the reader from looking at this thing into the experience of the person who violence is being done to. So ideas that influenced me there were like a filmmaker, actually, a film critic, Laura Mulvey, the male ideas around the male gaze and that kind of thing. But I did feel it's a question that Susan Sontag, who's a great influence on my thinking, asks in her book, Bearing Witness to the Pain, looking at the pain of others, and her book on photography. There isn't an easy and clean ethical place, but I still think you need to try.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we've got a question asking specifically about the genre, you know, that crime fiction, and in fact, referencing one of your essays where you write that misogyny is part of the grammar of crime fiction. I think that's from your essay on disgrace. And so, you know, this question is, how do you, as a feminist writer thinking about gendered violence, how do you avoid the eroticization of sexual violence in your own crime fiction? You know, and it's quite a complex question, and it might, and again, there's some interesting questions are coming in about the man that you've described as Claire Hart's sidekick, Ridwan Faisal. There's a whole cluster of questions coming in from people that have read Daddy's Girl about the particular relationship between those two that we'll come to in a minute. But I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about, you know, the sort of problems with the genre that you've described as having this kind of misogynistic grammar.
Well, when I started, so I'm looking back on having written a series, and I'm confronted again with the dilemmas of all these things, because the novels are now being developed as TV series, so they're going to be even more complex, some of those questions. When I started, there was another simple reason why I chose crime fiction. South Africa, with its stratification, meant that I needed a protagonist who went to wherever she went, or wherever he went in the society, because of his job, because of the history of segregation. Who is where is always a complicated question. If you're a cop, my experience as a journalist, being a journalist, gave me absolute permission to go anywhere. I wasn't always welcome. Often I was very welcome, but my job meant I could go from the most poverty-stricken areas all the way through to a cocktail party in the president's house, because that was my work. So it helped me solve an aesthetic question, a literary question. But when I started crime fiction, I thought I could completely explode and change. I mean, other women writers have done this, Sarah Paretsky is one, but change the genre. In the end, I stopped writing crime fiction because I felt it was actually impossible to really, really shift that gaze. I think I did what I could, and then I got to subject matter I couldn't deal with within that scopic. It's the distance of the viewer that always puts you, the reader, at the place of the perpetrator. So it's not solvable, but I don't think there's a way of writing without getting your hands dirty.
And one of the things that came up in your reading just now was a sense of South Africa's legacies and history, and certainly in that drive through the city and through the streets. You know, you mentioned all the streets with the sort of historical references back to colonial European expansionism, etc. And we've got a question in asking about how if and how you think gendered violence in contemporary South Africa is connected with the country's legacies of colonialism and slavery.
Absolutely, directly. I mean, one of the things, there's a number of complicated things. The discourse around crime shifted post-apartheid. So a very offensive discourse around race ended with apartheid, and it was switched over into discourses of othering, which then crime was substituted around race. So work you might want to look at, which really condenses this, is an essay I wrote about Oscar Pistorius's murder of his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, in which the old language that racist white South Africans used about the swart gevaar, the black danger, was then substituted. That they became the criminal they. So you have this direct replacement of fear and phobia and a kind of entitlement to do anything. In other Gallows Hill, which is the book I wrote after Daddy's Girl, I look at the structure of slavery, for instance, in that one. What happens in a society where and Cape Town has been a free city only a few years longer than it was a slave city. What happens when people are considered to be things? I took that as a fiction writer very literally and to explore that. So you can trace a direct link between the brutality of slavery, of colonialism, of apartheid into the present. And those are the origins of this very extreme form of violence, I think. Also the radical disjuncture between the rich and the poor, which has not really been resolved in the last 25 years.
Yeah, interesting answer. So it's like a kind of displacement that you're tracking from race to gendered violence. And how does that relate to another sort of...
Let me just say something about race and gendered violence. The essence, as I understand it, is of the kind of racism that was made so manifest in South Africa is extremely somatic definitions of the body. So there's a big overlap with a racialized body and a gendered body. They're not exactly the same, but they're deeply connected. And it's impossible to tease those things out, you know what I mean? So you get hierarchies of, for instance, under apartheid, white men would call black men who worked for them a boy. So there was a kind of gendered thing going on in every single aspect of society. So the only people who had recourse to pure and powerful masculinity were a certain kind of white men. I'm sure the parallels to where you're all listening to me from are very apparent. But yeah, so the gendering and the kind of this kind of creation of power through subjugation, I think is you can't extract it from South Africa's history at all.
That's interesting. And then as a creative writer, I'm just seeing an interesting question from Yusuf Basa Ammar, who's asking about, you know, that if you're using fiction to bring to light real issues and problems in South Africa, he's asking, how do you balance the amount of truth, you know, that how much do you exaggerate or manipulate? And that maybe relates back to what you were saying about, you know, clipping stories from the newspapers and then packing those into the text. I mean, in Daddy's Girl, there's an incredible amount, including the scene that you read out, of what might be seen as gratuitous violence, because it's not connected to the plot, but you're mapping out levels of violence kind of in addition to the plot, which is itself about violence against children and this kind of sexual violence in particular. So yes, Yusuf's asking about, you know, you as a creative writer, how much, you know, where does reality kind of
end and fiction begin?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you need to do, what fiction offers you in a country with extremely high murder rates or rape rates, what you do or what I've done in all my novels is focus on one crime or one or two crimes. So some of what I wanted to do was give the victims that I'd met and seen or heard of their narrative back and their lives back. So what you do is you take statistics. You know, it's kind of meaningless. I remember when I was writing, there were like 21,000 murders a year or some unbelievable number. It's like too many people to think about. But if you take one story, one person, what you're doing as a fiction writer is making people feel and be moved by that one person, which allows you, I think, to feel all of those people who are killed. So the difficulty is in a country with very high rates of violence is to distill down to make it meaningful, which if you compare, I had some hilarious things with the Scandinavian countries where my books are translated into and widely read. I remember reading in I think it was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, that the main cop had investigated 9 murders in his career of like 55 years. And I was thinking, oh my, that was ridiculous. You know what I mean? You'd have like 9 murders in a day in Cape Town. And so the requirement was completely the opposite, which is, I think, one of the reasons why crime fiction is quite rare in societies that aren't liberal, stable democracies. You know what I mean? So in a way, that what my crime fiction was doing in South Africa was animating the dead, rather than giving the reader a feeling of like, oh, dark and scary night, but everything is fine.
That's really interesting, because a couple of people have posed questions about the relationship between the way, you know, what you've just described, you know, the telling stories and making individual stories heard, the relationship between that and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And there's a very interesting question from Devon Kinney, who says, Claire Hart has a TV programme called Missing, where the stories of victims of sexual violence are shared in a highly public manner. And do you believe this type of sharing is overall a positive thing? And then he asks, how does Claire's occupation as a journalist and the Missing programme speak to the TRC? So very much thinking about, you know, that process of individualising stories, telling stories, yes, creating space and mediating those stories.
Okay, so my work was very directly, especially my work on trauma and narrative, was very directly influenced by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's absolutely, the link is completely clear. The 2 years I spent in the US, I'd actually, the focus of my work was the TRC. This was before I started writing this fiction, in the context of trauma studies, and Dominic LaCapra, various people who were looking at trauma and narrative in the US at that time. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I started publishing not that long after the TRC, the crime fiction, after the TRC finished. And I worked quite closely with a friend of mine, because those of you on Twitter might want to follow her, called Madeleine Fullard, who was part of the TRC and then set up a unit which tracks the missing and the disappeared in South Africa. She works for the National Prosecuting Authority, and have found people's remains and various things, tracked them down. So South Africa's experiment, and my work, I think, is part of that effort, in a way, is to work out how to bring these unbelievable number of years of silence around persecution and suffering and disappearances into the public domain, in an attempt to make other people realize what had happened, or how it had worked, to put it into the public discourse. And one of the things with gendered violence, which is specific to South Africa, but I think resonates around the world, is that it is an area of violence that is kept separate, because there's so much shame related to sex, there's so much shame related to a woman who's been somehow sullied through a sexual assault. So it was at the time in which rape as a crime of war became part of like UN protocols and various things. So it was looking at how those affected. So I see my work in dialogue with what the TRC was trying to do, and I see some of its achievements and some of its failures to do that with that. I think the fundamental failure is that writing and telling a story, and this is just a personal thing. I asked a rape victim I know very well what she wanted to do about it. You know, she was asking me about like going to, if she should go to the court, and she said to me, when she said that to me, I thought, that's what we want. In a way, what I've been trying to write is to unhappen things. But of course, one can't unhappen trauma, political or intimate. But what you can do is make it part of something that is a story in your life. So one of the things I've thought that the TRC tried to do, what I tried to do with this work and with my work with survivors of sexual violence and various things, violence makes a person a thing. You know, there's a lot of theory about this. You can all find it. It makes you a thing or a noun. Whereas an untraumatic life, one lives one's life as a verb. There's a kind of motion. Things happen, we move on. And kind of by telling a story, it's like finding a way in which we take this thing, this object, person made into an object through the act of another or through the gaze of another, and give her, usually her, but him to agency to move again, to be active, to kind of somehow integrate that on. And some of you who are interested in the sexual violence aspect of the gendered thing, you might want to read my only book that's set in Namibia called Blood Rose, in which all the victims are teenage boys, street boys, which are kind of the victims people find the least sympathetic because they're afraid of them, you know, the sort of hoodie gangs. And that was a very interesting process too, in how one creates a violation that's erased in a young man. We don't see young men who are perceived as socially threatening to be victims, which very often they are. So I don't know if that answers that question, but yes, my work is absolutely in dialogue with the TRC, and the focus of my PhD dissertation was very much around that notion of trauma.
Yeah, and it's very powerful what you say. Some people are asking about a kind of, given what you're saying, is there a kind of, like Awali, for example, is asking whether you and Dr. Hart overlapped, the extent to which you overlap. And it's interesting that Leica asks that because in one of your novels you describe Claire Hart's PhD, and it's very similar to how you describe your own PhD. But the wonderful kind of comedy, humor, paradox perhaps is that Claire Hart's written her PhD before yours.
I know, but she's got no children. That witch, she's got no children. Her PhD on rape and femicide, I actually lifted directly. It's a PhD that was written by a friend of mine called Professor Lorna Martin, who is the head of pathology at UCT and who gave me a great amount of access to the mortuaries of Cape Town and stuff. And that literally was, that PhD is a real one. She looked at it of serial rape and femicide. So, but I did follow in Claire's footsteps. I finally got my PhD. I had to I sort of kept up with her. But that one was based, all the science, all the facts, as much, this is going back to your previous question about what's fact and fiction, is deeply rooted and absolutely rooted in the kind of work I did as a journalist, which is find out how things are done, go and spend time in the labs, in the mortuaries, with the cops, with gangsters, in prisons. It's very, I've hidden the research, but it's very much rooted in how things happen.
There's a bundle of questions coming in that are kind of connected in a way, and they link up with some of the questions that were submitted before this session as well. And you've written about, Simi Fagbemi talks about how she read your essay about disgrace, and you've written about J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace as the text that moved you to become a writer. And Simi wonders why exactly the novel had such a huge impact on you, and whether through writing novels like Daddy's Girl you've been able to remedy the issues you saw in Coetzee's novel. And I think that connects to what you were saying about the TRC and about the space in terms of telling a story, making a story present. And that connects, it sort of bridges with some other questions that are coming in. There's one from Yasmin Bergerman, who asks about how you distinguish yourself from other predominantly male crime writers, but that might also include Coetzee as a male author writing about rape. So whether you've got a sense of a sort of a strong gender difference between yourself and male authors in talking about.
I'm much better dressed than them, all of them. Okay, so let me start with the first one about disgrace and how it prompted, why it turned me to fiction, to writing fiction. I don't know if people have read Disgrace, and it was a highly influential book. It's about this rape of a woman on a farm, and the protagonist you know, the whole story is kind of told basically from this sort of male perspective. And Coetzee, well, David Lurie, the protagonist of the novel, says he wonders, I got it in that essay that I think was circulated, but he wondered what the niche was for women. He thought to find this out, you'd need the help of an interpreter and a translator and anthropologists and the police. And I thought, yes, you would. Like, just get off your backside and do some work and find out. It's not rocket science. And I was so irritated at this fastidiousness and the sort of no, I don't know. I just sort of had enough of white men. So I thought, okay, let me see what happens when you get an interpreter and when you go and ask women questions. So that's what I did. I wrote into that space which he occluded, which is occluded in many ways by that book. I think it's a brilliant book. I think that it should absolutely be taken seriously in many ways because of what it can't see if you position yourself in a particular place. I position myself in another place which is not unproblematic at all, not at all. It's a very difficult position. The character I created is highly authoritative. She's very educated. There's all sorts of problems that she has as a lead character. But I went off to find out in fiction how we can deal with those things, because I don't think you can just quietly draw a curtain over what the Greeks called the oikos, the sort of female realm. I want that stuff out in the doxa, out in the public domain. You know, I mean, I think that women generally play a function, but it's one of the key things with sexual violence is that the shame that cannot be integrated by a perpetrator or by a dominant subject, he inserts that shame into somebody lesser than him in the social hierarchy, and she played like those old VHS machines. You must then play the shame tape, and I just say, push it out, push it out.
It's interesting that you talk in that way, because quite a few of the students on the South African literature course, where we had a discussion of Daddy's Girl on Tuesday, raised the question of Ridwan Faisal as. And I know that in the conversation that we had just before this session, you described feeling very fond of him.
Yes,
very fond of him. Now, let me just fill you in a little bit on, and I'm just so sorry that we can't see the audience today, because I know quite a lot of the students who commented on Ridwan Faisal, they're out there, and quite a few people, like Kaveh Zarul Islam, for example, described him as uber masculine policeman. You know, there's a sort of masculinity about him. There's somebody else comments on how he is willing to bend the rules to put a criminal behind bars, and, you know, asking, can you talk about your decision to depict him as a kind of bad, good cop, and whether that's, you know, is how ambivalent are you about his, you know, perhaps in the light of Black Lives Matter and the anti-SARS protests in Nigeria, you know, that he's somebody who's kind of ambiguous character, and he's also, for people that haven't read the novel, Ridwan Faisal has got a complaint against him, and even not quite a conviction, but he's had an accusation of domestic violence against his wife as well. And so we've got here, you know, given what you've said about, you know, the position of women and women's stories and violence against women, the sidekick policeman is very ambivalent. And so a lot of our questions are coming in about him. There's more, I mean, that, you know, and again, you portray a very positive father-daughter relationship between him and his girl. And, you know, just could you talk a little bit more about him as a character, and whether you agree that he's the sort of hyper-masculine, and whether
he absolutely is. I mean, there's a whole layer of answering this question. So just in terms of genre, Ridwan Faisal is a sort of classic action man of crime fiction. You know what I mean? He's like, he makes things happen. He makes things kind of, there's activity whenever he's on the page. I spent a lot of time working with the police. I spent really, really, really a lot of time with them on you know, going out with the cops on the beat and with specialist cops. And what I was interested in with the depiction of the police, and this goes back to what one does as a journalist. As a journalist, I saw a lot of police corruption. I saw a great deal of bravery, I have to say. But I also saw a lot of corruption. I saw a lot of violence. And then your job as a reporter is to report on that, or literally report it if you see some criminal activity. As a fiction writer, what I was interested in doing was not writing about how things should be, but how they were. And I chose, Red One is kind of fashioned of a cop who became, who I spent a lot of time, it's actually two cops. One is sort of, I merged them. He'd been in prison and in the armed struggle, so kind of jailed for both activities. And then he was in Mkhonto, so he was a freedom fighter, and then he became a very senior policeman. And there is a culture of masculinity, a cult of masculinity in the police, which causes massive social and personal dysfunction. I'll give you one little anecdote. I asked this guy who was he's a colonel, head of the psychological crimes unit, which profiles serial murder and serial rape. And I said to him, like, what do you do for a break? You know, like, because I mean, the crimes he was dealing with were horrific. And he said, I take a week off, I sit in my flat, I drink, and then I go back to work. And I thought, how do I write a character like that? I mean, Red One is not modeled on that guy. I saw these men struggling, caught in a very patriarchal culture where there's only one kind of way of being a man, which is often hyper aggressive, and caught in this very difficult thing. And I was interested in that. To me, is the problem of South Africa, of the US as well, I think. And what I was interested in depicting it. So this Daddy's Girl is like the first in a series of 5. You see a very interesting arc with Red One over the series of books, in which this way of being in the world is less and less sustainable. I didn't intend this, but interestingly, Claire, who's quite tender in the beginning, she becomes more and more hard. In a way, I suppose how I did, I was doing the work, you become more and more inured to these things. So what I was interested in was depicting a flawed character. I didn't want to lionize or make it heroic, but at all. But this mixture with Red One, also his position as an outsider, you know, he's a Muslim, he's positioned in a particular switchover from cops that were all white in the senior management when he starts as a cop historically, to now all the senior management being all black. He's positioned, he's always askance, which to me is always an interesting psychological position. Claire, if I look back on the book, I mean, you don't always know what you're doing in the book, but I think I set her up, and I think this is what many women do. She absorbs. There's a scene where she stops his fist or something, like right up against the chest. It's the way in which women absorb social violence in a patriarchy. She became, I didn't realize I was doing it to a poor woman, but she absorbed a lot of this violence, which kind of softens him in a way.
That's interesting you say that. Yeah, interesting. And because quite a few people are writing about, you know, about your work as feminist writing, and I'm sure you yourself would also describe it as feminist writing.
Yes.
So that kind of analysis of the absorption, you know, Claire Hart as a, you know, that given her feminist profile and given the work that she does to bring to light stories of gendered violence, especially against girls, you know, it's interesting that you've allowed that space for her to be kind of absorbing his changing, you know, his as he becomes gentler, she's absorbing it and facilitating it.
Yeah, I mean, I think how she functions, how the relationship functions over the series of things. There was so much rape and awful stuff going on. I actually needed a place for me and the reader to rest with a couple who had a great deal of attraction to each other. And any of you who've watched Ballard's Crash, you know that there's a lot of sexual energy is generated with people who round too many bodies and stuff like that. You know, there's that sort of thing, but there's a genuine rapport between them, and they both understand each other's work. That's kind of brings them together. But she's actually more, I find her more closed off than he is. Yeah. I mean, he probably should be better, but he's not.
We've got some questions coming in about, there's a character, Salome Ndlovu.
Yes.
And people were very, Amri Proman in particular, there's 3 questions about her actually, that she's, you know, how does she fit into the feminist framework of the text? Because she's quite an ambivalent character. She's somebody who, her feminism, in fact, obstructs the inquiry into the abduction of Redwan's daughter, and she's got this sort of, what would we call her, a politically correct character. What's her feminism to you in relation to the sort of feminism that shapes the project as a whole?
She, I suppose she's a sort of bureaucrat, you know what I mean? She's sort of been like sort of helicoptered in with a kind of, when you have a whole lot of decisions that are made about how things are meant to happen and protocols that are meant to be followed. And yes, she's absolutely correct. Redwan, you know, probably should be locked up, and he actually hasn't done the things he's kind of been accused of doing. But she represented something that I think, you know, South Africans, is quite difficult, where you have this kind of whole set of protocols about how things should be done, when the reality of life is that it doesn't fit always into those kind of ordered ways of doing things. So you've got also, I suppose it represents in the police, this kind of trying to civilize the police force a little bit, and to kind of rein in these guys who often do solve issues just because they're so dogged and determined. But, you know, the feminism is a complicated question. You know, there's like, if you have a message, I think it was Mark Twain who said it, use Western Union. My feminist, I mean, I'm absolutely a feminist in quite a sort of militant way, but as a writer, what I was more interested in was depicting what happens, if you know what I mean, is to illuminate areas of where things are done. And this is a social conflict in all sorts of places. How do you marry those two things? What do you do with people who go absolutely by the book when what is happening is not by the book? So it's a transition you see in quite a lot of crime fiction. I mean, I think, you know, as police forces got more and more systematized, these guys were kind of reined in, and it's a good thing, and probably not always a tricky thing too sometimes.
There's quite a few people are thinking about the current situation in America, you know,
yes.
The violence, police brutality against Black Americans, and then kind of looking into your work to think about the level that you're perhaps critiquing the police force, shining a light on the police force, or you know, hoping for better.
Well, I was writing at a very particular period in South Africa. I think that one of the reasons, and I've written about this, one of the reasons I stopped writing crime fiction was the police massacre of mine workers at Marikana mine in 2013, I think it happened. And it happened while I was writing my last book, Water Music, and I had to incorporate it into the story. And it was an event, this massive 36 miners were pincer movemented by the cops and assassinated. Redwan Faisal, who I'd set up as a good cop in a bad situation, or sort of bad guy, but who does good, this is where fiction and reality meet. I could not keep him in the police. It was not possible with the way I'd set up his character, so he resigns because I set up a sort of version in that last book about him going, he couldn't work for the police anymore. So my own experience of the police, and one of the reasons I was interested in the police was my own personal experience of their brutality in the 1980s, directed to thousands of people and directly to me. But there was a period in South Africa, and this is worth bearing in mind when you consider this work, where that police force, and Salome Ndlovu is an example of that, made this real attempt to go from a police force. They changed the name to a police service, which was much more the British idea of policing, not armed, sort of community policing, etc. There was a switch which happened just before, a couple of years before Marikana, in which the police, there was a dreadful head of police, very, very aggressive. He said, shoot to kill, the warning shots, people jumped up and hit the warning shots, and very much like American policing. And the police service was renamed the police force, and it became nakedly brutal again. It like reverted to type. It was so in the culture. So the period I was writing and working with the police was where it tried to shift, and it failed. So Ridwan leaves the police force, Claire stops working with him. They became a paramilitary force, basically. So it was not possible I didn't find it possible to write within the cops anymore. So I think that, I do think police forces are inherently brutal. An armed police force will kill people. They're structurally racist. There's no way you can get away from that. And any, what's happening in the States is exactly what happened and still happens in South Africa. I don't think it's possible to reform a police force, given that its origins in the US and in South Africa were with white supremacy, and in order to defend white supremacy. That might sound very simplistic, but my novels in a way were documentation of where this tried to shift, and it throws up in retrospect a lot of what made it impossible, I think. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does very powerfully. Thank you. I'm aware that we haven't had time to have your second reading, but I know what your second reading related to. So I'm going to ask you, rather than actually to have your second reading, I'm going to ask you to talk, and it's a question that came in from Yusuf Baza Amar, about who was very interested in your imprisonment as a student in Cape Town. Now, you might like to mesh this with a little bit of a second reading. We don't have a huge amount of time, but Yusuf's interested in what ways your own imprisonment has influenced your work as a writer, not just as a creative writer, but your work for PEN and other organisations as well, perhaps.
I would say thank you to Yusuf for that question. It's that experience, that prison experience, I think is the thing that formed me as a person, formed me as an adult. It's like I was 21 when I was detained, and it was an experience. So I was in solitary confinement. I had lots of security police interrogations. I was charged with treason, which in South Africa carried the death penalty in those days, and my throat just closed up, because it was death by hanging, and it was so mad. But it was the experience of my life that made me realize two things. So one is that it's absolutely essential that one stands up for the rights of others, and the right to free expression, the right to associate freely, and democracy and open society. The other thing it's given me, and I'm working on a memoir at the moment, which is sort of, I suppose, come out of this work I've done on violence, is that the absolute powerlessness that I experienced at the hands of the police has informed all the work that I've done subsequently, all the novels. Every single novel, if I look at it, is what happens when a person with no power, their power is taken away from them, is at the hands of somebody whose capacity to do violence towards them is limitless. I mean, we all saw that with George Floyd, what happens when there's no restraint, and it's the most terrifying and sort of dehumanizing experience. So maybe instead of reading the whole thing, I could maybe just read a little piece about my experience with the security police, with the questioning with the cops. That might give, because it's such a highly gendered thing as well, you know, you're kind of, so I tell, in the thing I told the story, I was picked up under the state of emergency, and just to put myself in context, I was not special. There were 35,000 people in detention at the time, and I think 3,000, almost 3,000 were under the age of 13. So don't think I was seriously not brave. I fainted when I got arrested. It was absolutely, it was nothing special in a way that what happened. It was what happens when there is no democracy. So I got taken in and we put into our cells, and nobody could see you, no access to a lawyer, nothing. So a seagull screeches and I'm awake. I climb onto the narrow table and I can't see out of my cell. I can't see the gull, but I can hear it as it circles. When its cries begin to fade and I go with it as it banks and turns. Together we go back to the ocean. It's only a couple of miles away in Muizenberg, where the surfers keep an eye out for the sharks. I soar with the gulls, smell the sea. I've already been in prison for a few days, I think. Go on another mile along the coast. See the fishing boats go in and out of Cork Bay Harbour, where the seals arc brown backs under the swell and the women gut and sell their men's catch on the dock, and the strutting seagulls skewer the severed heads tossed their way. Last time I was there, I saw them snatch a whole fish when no one was looking. I jumped onto the floor and tried to do push-ups like real political prisoners, but my arms do not see the sense of what I'm making them do, and they refuse to lift me. It's late when they finally send for me. A warden I don't know calls my name, and I get down off my bunk. I have no time to dress. I must come in my nightie. I cross my arms over my breasts because I'm not wearing a bra. And we walk through the corridors to a section of this vast prison I have not seen before. It's empty. No hands reach between the bars. No one drums against the metal grills. No voices call out. My escort is not happy. They come here and make us bring you, she mutters as she unlocks the last door. I wait while she locks it again. Then they make us wait outside, she tells me. If anything happens to you, it's us to blame. I'm so sorry, I say. We're just prisons. This politics thing has nothing to do with us. Her hand is on my elbow. My legs refuse to move, but she propels me briskly down the dim corridor. At the end of it is a rectangle of light. A rectangle of light spills from the open door. We enter. There are two men. One leans against the wall and the other sits behind the table that has a slim folder on it. My empty stomach growls and the sound fills the room. The seated man looks up at me. Miss Orford, he smiles. Good evening. I don't hear the warden's footsteps recede, but I hear the door close. The questions start. Who told you to march? Who recruited you? This is better, I tell myself. I'm quicker-witted than they are. I apply my mind to what they ask me, but I don't reply. Don't ask anything, is the warning I was given. I have no answers to give in any case, no answers that will satisfy. I don't know anything. Who's in charge? Why do you do this? Where are the orders from? He lists names. Some I know, some I don't. The others will tell you, he says, will tell us, he says. It's better if you do too. The silent man peels himself off the wall and moves towards me. He's close enough for me to feel his body heat, and the hairs on my arm rise, and so does my nipple. It pushes at my nightdress. I fold my arms again. My breasts are burning with shame, and I feel his breath on my neck. I may as well be naked. I'm only clothed because they have decided not to strip me. What do you know about these people? Who are their friends? Why do we do this to protect you, my interrogator says. Protect me from what? It's the first time I speak, and it is a mistake. You've seen what the blacks do, says the man next to me, the bad cop. You think a necklace is a nice thing? I see a petrol-filled tire around a woman's neck, a match being struck, the crowd, the agonizing death, and I want to move away, but there's nowhere to go. The good cop gestures, and the man steps back to his position against the wall. Who told you to go, says the good cop. I'm so relieved that I answer him. Nobody. Where are they? I don't know. Who's in charge? I don't know. Who is this? He takes a photograph out of the folder. It's me. My feet are bare and I'm wearing a tight blue and white 50s dress that my mother made me, and I'm standing on a balcony of a house at a party I've forgotten. It's me, I say. But that's not what they are asking. They want to know about the people I am talking to. I have nothing to tell them. He lays out more photographs, rallies, meetings. Who sent you here and here and here and here? Nobody. I repeat the stupid word because it's true. Why did you do it then? Because what you're doing is wrong, I venture. Who told you that? Give us their names. Nobody told me, I say. I can see for myself. Silence fills the room. They can do anything to me. That they don't do it now is no comfort. Vat haar terug, take her back, the seated man shouts in the direction of the door, and the warden reappears. Her eyes search for my face, for the shaving of a second before she marches me back to my cell. I curl up on my bed. A sense of belonging, of trust in a shared humanity falls from me like a snake's skin, outgrown. There we go.
Wow. Thank you so much, Margie. I don't think we should continue after that. It was so powerful and engaging. We certainly all look forward to reading your memoir.
So do I.
Oh, well, I just want to say thank you on behalf of everybody who's attended this session. And sorry you haven't been able to see people in person, but there's certainly been a lot of questions coming in. I'm sorry to the people whose questions I haven't been able to ask of Margie. And I just want to say thanks on behalf of all of us for a really fantastic, interesting, engaging, powerful, moving session. So thanks, Margie.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And just thank you to all of you who I imagine are there, unless we're completely mad. And I wish I could see your lovely faces. And thanks for the questions.
Thank you.